All right, so for this session, I figured I would just kind of go through a little bit of the code, and then if there's any questions about that, we can discuss that, or we can talk about some of the some speaking or talking points that I had. So just as far as the role definitions go inside the kernel or inside the hypervisor, this is within the struct domain. So these are the roles that I've talked about in the presentation for those that have seen it, but just to kind of roll through them, there's the implicit ones, which are none, self, and target. And then there's the explicit roles in terms of the platform control, domain builder, domain supervisor, device simulation, device backend, hardware control, hardware supervisor, and then XinStore. So from there, so currently within the dummy policy, which is what's actually invoked whether you have XSM enabled or not, the dummy policy is always involved unless you do turn on XSM and use an alternate policy. So the focus was on converting all that to the role-based, a very well-defined role-based solution. So this is the current default action. So for those that don't see it initially, like such as I missed this until it was pointed out. So this is a DUF device where we've got a set of if statements wrapped or overlaid with a switch statement to kind of handle all the variety of permission checks that is currently available. What I did in roles is I kind of, if you follow the patch set, it kind of does a migration through to get to eventually this configuration here, or this function here. So this is now we're going to validate a role. So if no role is required, it immediately returns. There's your self check and your target check at the top. Device simulation is the one that has a little bit more of a complicated check here, where you want to make sure that it has that role and that it has a target defined for it, and that target is the target domain for which the operation is being attempted. And then the remaining roles, I mask out the 3 checks we already done, and then just see if the roles that a domain has is any of the ones that should be remaining. And of course, if none of these wind up matching, you get ePerm. Way that winds up getting there. So these are some helpers that allows me to, just so I don't have to keep typing the same redundant code all the way through on all the hooks. Pretty straightforward. When an XSM op needs to be called, check if the op structure has been defined. If it's been defined, has the op been defined? And if it has been, then make that call as opposed to following through. There are some XSM ops that have a non-return value. And so this is for those cases. And then something that was present in the existing code that I maintained is a check that when you do, which we'll see in a moment, when you set up an XSM hook inside of the hypervisor, a lot of them allowed you to pass what the default action was. I changed that to basically the allowed roles to be passed through. And then in the actual SSM check itself, or inside the hook function, it basically, you declared what default action, which now has become roles, you are allowing to come through. And this just made sure that those matched. So you can see that when it comes to like domain create, for example. So inside of the actual code here, this is down inside of your DOM control code. There's the DOM create call, which comes through and hits the XSM domain create hook. If you'll notice here, this is XSM none. This is because the equivalent was XSM hook, which basically immediately returned. If I can go back and look at the original code. The way the hooks have been defined today is that the top level code, or the top level hypercall, is where the role check is done. And then the remainder of any XSM hooks were just allowed to pass through. So if you succeeded on being able to make the hypercall, then any other fine-grained hooks were just allowed through. So that's what's set today. this is one of those areas that's proposed about maybe going back through and changing these over to what roles we actually really want to be making these lower calls or not. So that comes through, and this is pretty much the template of all the hooks get turned into. So it gets turned into an XSM op call to check if and see if there has been an XSM op defined for this. So if XSM's turned on, this will check out to be true. If not, or if there hasn't been an op defined, like in Silo only defines only a handful of operations it wants to hook, it falls through. We do an allowed role check, and then we do a validate role call to go back to the function. I didn't put a copy of the predecessor code that was here, but this is pretty much outside of this hook call. This is pretty much how the dummy policy hooks were defined. They just did the quick check, and then they did a call to the default action. So the change here is just more in terminology than it is in functionality outside of the function change. And I just threw another example in here just so you can see when there's a case for a non-return. So this is how one of the non-returns happens. So in the past, no role checks were occurring for non-return calls. So I maintained that for the time being. So that's pretty much the extent of a lot of the code change. I did not bring in the is control name is hardware domain checks. Is control domain check, its replacement was pretty straightforward. It just mainly checks that the right priv, the right role has been set on the XSM-Roles. And then the hardware domain is similar, except for it also, as I discussed, also checks to see if it matches the global reference to the hardware domain. So as I said, so some points of discussion is, should we consider putting subsequent checks so that we don't rely on the hypercall access check alone, or we can leave it as is. It winds up fast passing, not fast pathing, but it'll return a lot faster, right? Because it'll immediately return out of the top of that is role domain check. And then, are there additional roles people think should be defined as that would be applicable to some use cases? And then finally, what concerns reviewers or committers might have that they'd like to see us ensure have been addressed before we transition from an RFC to a formal patch. Here. Okay. So any questions or comments, discussion?
I have to say the return in the middle of the macro is quite dangerous. I'm not entirely happy with that. This is easily missed, and if there is a lock before, then people might not notice there is a lock to be unlocked here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Personally, I think it would be much better if these weren't macros. Personally, I hate macros for stuff like this, and what we've got in Zen is already too much. Other thing I would consider whilst we're making structural changes like this, I know I'm technically scope creeping here, but I think it's in the general long term good. At the moment, we have the XSM ops structure and XSM ops dereference. That's actually a large amount of code, and it's all pointer chasing. What we do, for example, with the IOMMU structure and the HVM ops structure is actually have one of them in memory and update them once at boot time, and then turn the result into direct calls. So it's a little bit similar to Linux's static calls. I mean, it's done differently, but the result there is that because we choose the XSM ops either by by compiled in policy or by what's on the command line. But the moment you've booted, it's fixed and it can't be changed, nor would you want it to change.
Actually, that's not necessarily true. It does change. It can be changed. You can't, there's no, there's code in there for Flask to unregister itself. There's no code anywhere to put something new in place, though. So there's no path to get there, but it does change. And actually, I persisted that.
Is that a sensible thing? I'm sure you can unload the Flask policy or load a dummy Flask policy that says everyone has full perms. But surely we don't want to cater to a theoretical use case where you did have Flask enabled and you wanted to switch to Silo, for example. I just don't think that's a sensible thing to even support changing in the middle. To Jason's point, a policy change, yes, fine, but actually switching the in-use module, I don't think is something we want to do. And switching to the thing a little bit like static calls would prevent changing the module, but it wouldn't prevent changing the policy implemented with that module. In which case, what you would get as the resulting code, well, actually, what you get right now isn't great. I have a plan to rewrite the infrastructure, but what you would end up getting is a direct call, no function pointers and nothing.
Yeah. So my point is that in there today, the Flask module, there is code in place for the Flask module to remove itself from the XenOps structure and put the dummy policy back in place. Because yes, there is existing code, and I maintain that code for the time being. And I was like, I don't know why it's here. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I left it. There is no way to necessarily get to it directly through any hypercalls that I can think of. I didn't do a full tracing to get there. I just persisted it for the time being. Now, realize what's happened with this change now is that the way this works, and I want to get back to the macros as well. The way this works now is that if there's not an XSM ops structure registered, then you will always do the role-based policy enforcement, the role enforcement. So that was the way that was kind of handled before. Was if you go look in there was a validate XSM ops validate function, and basically what it would do is it would walk through the ops structure that you passed it for your policy module, and in any function that you did not define, it basically hooked the dummy policy in place for that call. So instead of keeping the doing that, I basically made it so that a way the roles was always there and would always fall back to the roles. And then if you had a policy module loaded that then hooked the ops calls, then it would those would get called instead. And that's what these macros were doing. Is so instead of writing these 2 lines of code, I don't know off the top of my head, 20 some odd times through all the different XSM hooks, because this is what all the XSM hooks get turned into. The functions behind the XSM hooks all get turned into this. So that the only thing that uses these macros are the XSM hooks themselves. And it's meant as just a reduced code redundancy. But I can drop the macros and just replace the 2 lines of code, 2 or 3 lines, depending on if it's the no return or return code.
I less object to macros than I just object. Then I agree with people that having a return from the macro it's not obvious. I mean, if it is limited to just that little bits of code, then I don't know. I could maybe squint and look the other way, but if there was some other way to structure it, that would be better.
I mean, I can use. Oh, go ahead.
I was actually wondering, I was looking at the patch on the main list, and I was wondering whether we could just generate the function from the macro, which means that, yes, it's still a macro, it's not that nice, but it's not like a return in the middle of a macro, it's a function implementing using the macro.
Right, but if you do the function, you have to, I guess we could check the return, and then if the return doesn't, well, we'd have to define because I looked at that. So what ends up happening is the pattern is if there's an op structure and the op structure has the op defined, call that and then just return the value from that call, or just return if there is no value to be returned. If that test is false, then it goes and makes the call. So let me get to the next slide here.
To be perfectly
basically,
honest, I think that in this specific case, writing that out in longhand would be better.
Okay, that's fine. I can just quickly do a vim replace and swap it all back out.
I mean, realistically, what you want to do is run it through the C preprocessor, because then it will also do the function parameters correctly for you as well.
Yeah.
A general concern I have is that all of this is very opaque logic, and hiding stuff in macros is worse than a little bit of open coding of a similar structure.
That's fine. I'm okay with that. I just just providing the reason why I did it. So
I think the reality is that seeing as you are trying to take this system that has been slowly bit rotting for a while and turn it into something that can be properly supported and security supported long term, I think it is reasonable to make structured changes to it. If it makes things like unloading the Flask module, that doesn't appear to make any sense whatsoever. And if deleting it is going to simplify the cleanup, let's take a decision to do that. It's valid to change how this works. If it is going to mean the difference between being easy to security support and being a total nightmare to security support.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've
maintainer, right?
What's that?
There is still an XSM maintainer, right? That does respond to XSM stuff.
No, he doesn't anymore.
He doesn't anymore, right? Okay, fair enough then.
Yeah. So
we believe he's busy with other things.
Yeah, so one of the things I was trying to do is actually simplify this, because in my opinion, what was there with the way, as I explained at the higher view of what it was doing with if-defs to basically determine where all the function, the static inlines for the dummy policy ended up. It's what do you want to say? It's a level of indirection that was a little hard to follow. And so this hopefully will help simplify that. I was trying to choose my words carefully. Yes. So, this eliminates a lot of this, right? And the funny thing is like, XSM was declared as unsupported, but the fact is it really was in place at all times. It's just how were the hooks actually getting, how were the hook calls actually getting serviced, and whether they were getting serviced by static inline functions in the header, or whether they were getting called through the XenOp XSM op structure or dispatcher. So, and then there's duplicates of the wrappers that could get turned on, which is something that was done. Looks like it was done for Silo. So all that kind of gets dropped away. Silo gets simplified now as well.
Yes, we put Silo in very specifically to fix a problem we had at the time. There's even a note in the Zen server patch queue saying try and do Silo with Flask when Flask is better. So Silo is there to serve a purpose, but if the same purpose can be achieved in a less awful way, we will happily use the less awful way.
Yeah.
It's just
And
at the time, the way we did it seemed to be the least awful way of making it work.
Yeah. So, and that's one of the things is like, I'm not trying to displace Flask. I would actually advocate if you want to do anything beyond just the default way of Zen behaves, I would recommend Flask. But at the same time, I'm trying to balance that maybe not everybody wants the overhead that does get incurred with Flask. It's not great. It's not a substantial amount of overhead, but there is still an overhead that you have to accept. Okay. So I guess the other question is, are there any additional roles? Is there some of the things I didn't think about is some of the extra use cases that are out there, like the introspection, right? Should there be a role for introspection? Are there some other roles?
So I still can't actually make my mind up as to whether introspection wants to be another role or just part of emulation.
Yeah.
It certainly shares a lot of commonality with emulation.
Yeah. I guess so outside of the dropping the macros, I'll take a look at the Linux static calls and see if I can create something similar to that with this. What was the other structure you said that does it?
Linux static calls was only the example. So in Zen, we have an implementation of that works a little like Linux static calls. So take a look and see how the HVM func structure gets used.
Or the IOMMU call also.
Yeah, it's called alternative vcall, I think. But basically, it is a way of taking a function pointer, structure, and turning all the function pointer calls into plain calls. Because with things like the HVM ops, you're either using VTX or SVM based on the hardware you boot on. With the IOMMU, similarly, your driver is either the Intel IOMMU driver or the AMD based on the hardware you boot on. XSM, okay, the individual module you're using might be dynamically chosen, but it's fixed from very early in the boot. And in particular, what it means is you're not taking the Repoline overhead for function pointer calls. Okay. So these days, as much as anything else, it is a performance improvement to mitigate some of the costs from Spectre v2 protections, which are large.
Okay. I guess we got plenty of time. So I guess for me, one of the questions is what's next steps? Is the RFC, I mean, if I address these concerns, would it be preferred that I send another RFC out, or could I promote this to a formal submitted patch set and then iterate over everybody's concerns from there?
It'll probably be good to adjust the macros if no one has commented on it that far. But after that, just send out something claiming to be V2.
Okay.
You're more likely to get people to look at something that claims to be V2 than claims to be RFC V2.
Understood. All right.
Who will be meant to review it if the XSM manners is not answering?
I'm sorry, if the XSM's not doing what?
Well, I think there is quite a few patches on the main list for XSM that has been left unanswered, and I think you've been doing the review with Jason, if I remember correctly.
I've been trying to, yes.
Yeah, so I was trying to figure out who will be responsible of doing the hack for it. Is it going to fall on the committers, or is it between you and Jason?
By default, it would be the rest, but if Daniel has actually been doing a lot of the review for the XSM stuff, then someone could, recommend him to be the maintainer for XSM. And then basically all it requires is someone who's not him to give it a review by.
Which I think
I'm
would
not
be fair, yeah.
I'm not sure if that's what something Daniel wants or whatever. So if someone thinks that that's a good idea, then feel free to push the patch.
It would be nice if we could get Dan DeGraaf's view on this, but he is proving to be quite hard to contact at the moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to jump straight to maintainer. I was just trying to at least get to a reviewer status.
Right.
But
to be perfectly honest, anyone actually trying to push this forward into a better state gets 9/10 of the vote.
Yeah.
Considering that there are 0 other votes in the matter.
Yeah. Okay.
To be perfectly honest, I'm more than, as it currently stands, we have one listed XSM maintainer who doesn't actually reply. At that point, if there's a whole set of cleanup that looks like good cleanup and it's reviewed suitably by other people in the rest, then yeah, as far as I'm concerned, that's good to go in. The part of the purpose of the group called the rest is to make decisions like this when there isn't an obvious reviewer. And sometimes that's because it's a weird part of the tree that doesn't fall in the structure, but it also covers cases of reviewers being out and missing.
MIA, yep, exactly.
So what you could do is write an email with all the things you would like Daniel DeGraaf to approve, including transition to other people, and send it to him and copy Daniel. Then Daniel can print that out, find Daniel in person, take a photo with a thumbs up sign, and approve all of them at once. And then maybe they can be an email as well. That would be nice. But if not, just get it done all at once.
Yes, I can take some actions if
The other option would be to, if you can actually get in contact with him, is have him propose a change to the maintainer's file. That would be the normal way of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, whatever you want. I just think, spell it out and say, Daniel, please do, the following. DDG, please do these 5 things. Make it easy for him.
No. Either first agree a change to the maintainer's file or review all of this stuff. Both are acceptable.
That sounds more like a threat than...
Well,
I mean, fundamentally, as a project that needs to make changes in this area, there has to be a point at which we cut off people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the reason we have the
we would
and the escalation thing and whatever.
Yeah. So. We would prefer to do this with everyone's consent. But if the worst comes to the worst, the purpose of the rest is to take decisions like this and have a final yes or no say on it. And as I said, my opinion is that a lot of this looks like very clear improvements to the situation.
I had a question. I mean, we arrived at this set of roles that Daniel's presented from looking at, what's currently in Zen and the restructuring stuff we're looking from deprivileging DOM 0. But I really would be interested if there are use cases, maybe from the guys who are doing the ARM and embedded stuff, where there are different roles people would like to see.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a bit early.
I mean, as we progress this, I mean, some of the other questions that I didn't put up here, which goes to the tool stack people, is that do we expose ways for roles to be assigned during runtime for domain assignment or domain
So at the
creation?
moment, during domain create, you can pass Flask SID, I think, in as a parameter.
Yes, you can. And we could co-opt that. I try to not co-opt too much of the Flask stuff because
on a local patch to Silo, I definitely co-opted that because it was a field in a hypercall that we already had.
Yeah, and we very much could. So, I was trying to be very surgical in my changes here to get clean up and get it so we can do, the end goal for us really, right, is this is a subtask of hyperlaunch. We want to be able to do a disaggregated launch with a separate hardware domain and still be able to do PCI pass-through. So that's kind of what this is for, focused at. And Jillian, did you have a question?
I was wondering, is XSM only used on the current domain, or can it be used on a separate domain when this is called?
I'm trying to understand what exactly you're trying to achieve there. So
what I'm trying to understand is the complexity of modifying it at runtime. If you want to modify at runtime, then if it's only the current domain that's doing the XSM code, then posing the domain is fine. If not, then you will have some fun to make sure that it is correctly exposed to everyone.
Okay. I see what you're saying. Now, so I guess I should be clarify what I meant by runtime. So since this is focused on hyperlaunch, we're looking at boot time setup, and so at boot time in the configuration that's passed in from the bootloader, you can specify what roles. The idea is you'll be able to specify what roles a domain has, so that way for when it's getting constructed, right? So you don't have to figure that all out. So outside of that, there is no way currently to assign a role after the system is started and running. Not necessarily changing the role of a running domain. I was more, when you do domain creation, being able to also decide what role you want that domain to have, especially if we start considering some more additional roles, especially for the embedded solutions, if there's a need to do that. So, and this would be, and it is very much, as Andy pointed out, it is very much like assigning what Flask label you want on a domain when you create the domain. That it is the same idea. And we could, as Andy said, we could just go ahead and co-opt the SID and start using the SID as well as a means to provide
what
that.
we might want to actually do is rename the Flask SID to something slightly more generic, like XSM label.
Yes, we could do that.
The reality is it's not specific to Flask. So
yeah. And reality is, even though in my mind I try to keep it so that the two could kind of coexist at the same time, at no time would they really ever coexist, right? Because when it comes to Flask defines all of the available hooks, and so you would never have to do a role check if you turned on Flask, which is not necessarily true with Silo. Well, actually, I turned Silo into just using the roles in general, so it would be a legitimate use of the label then. Does that answer your question, Julian, or was there something more to it and I just missed it?
No, I think this is answering also to what you meant when a domain is running, changing its role. That's why I was a bit confused.
Yeah, that's what I was worried about. So, okay, good. Yeah, now I was not meaning run. When I meant runtime, I meant Zen is now running as opposed to during the boot of Zen and assigning domain roles to the initial domains being started as part of Zen Startup through Hyperlaunch.
Makes sense, and I think it would be similar to Flask.
Yeah.
I think Andrew said that, which would make sense to me.
So the one interesting question here is whether you want to assign roles as part of Hyperlaunch building the domains, or whether you want to assign roles as part of the boot domain doing various things.
So we definitely want the former, because if you want to do a configuration.
Hello?
Sorry. So yes, we do want to do the former because we want to be able to boot without a boot domain. The question is whether or not we want to do the latter and allow the boot domain to assign the roles. And that might be, I did not consider that, and that would make a strong justification for using the hypercalls to change the role.
So at the moment, I think the only way of specifying this is in the domain create hypercall.
So there is one other hypercall that you can do it in. So this one's, and this would be, I don't know why it's there necessarily, but there is an XSM hypercall in which you can invoke an XSM op.
Yeah, there are a lot of hypercalls that fall into that category. We really should go pruning them at some point.
So we could actually use the XSM hypercall op to, we could define a new a subcommand in that op to relabel. So actually, I think it might already be there.
So the reason I asked, well, partly was because I misunderstood your question the first time around, but the other thing to say is that we do have it's an awkwardly named Boolean. It's something like D completion creation complete or something like that, which is a Boolean we use to cover a couple of cases. It gets set to true the first time the pause count drops to 0. So essentially it delineates the phase of physically constructing the VM versus the phase of the VM actually starting to execute code. So it might also be the kind of thing where you might be able to say, well, we'll permit relabeling a VM up until the point at which it starts executing. So that is something we would be able to express with some of the infrastructure that we already have. At the moment, we have a similar restriction on changing the CPU ID policy for the VM. We will permit changes in CPU ID policy before the VM starts executing and not thereafter. For anyone who was around in the earlier design session, this is soon going to involve changes in data structure sizes as we start trying to support Intel's next generation server platform, which has some silly data sizes in it.
Okay. Right.
So you should have a plan for the long-term ABI, right? Because since you're poking around in XSM, it's a chance to clean up the hypercalls and say, this is what we want for the future.
Okay.
And if that random one that you just discovered is part of that, then great. But if it should be taken out, now would be the time to take it out. The other thing is, remember the list of use cases in the Hyperlaunch keynote? It's probably good to, for each of those slides, just walk through the roles and how people would use it at some point.
So I'm almost out of time, and nobody commented on this, so I'm going to throw it out one more time. So as I highlighted, today the way the default prov check worked and the way I made the role check work is that we only check if the necessary roles are present at the top level of the hypercall, as opposed to any of the sub-ops. And all the sub-ops are allowed to just pass straight through. The question is should we also enforce the check, and whether it's just the same set of roles as what was being checked at the top level at each of the sub-levels, instead of just allowing them. It just makes me unnervous that if for some reason you could jump over the top level check at the beginning, that will generally allow you to make any sub-op call in that hypercall.
Why would you be able to jump over the top level check and not jump over this lower level checks?
If you put a bug in the top level hypercall handler, it's a defense in depth argument.
Yeah.
I have to admit that I was very confused whilst we were trying to figure out how any of this worked. We spent a while staring at the code, figuring out where any of the security was.
Right.
Yeah.
I found it very surprising when you look at domain create and it has that hook, which, is no check at all.
Yep.
So I think it makes more logical sense to push them down to where they matter more. But I guess I wasn't clear if every check like that was only done on hypercall entry versus only. They seem to be
it's
mixed.
complicated. So a lot of the second order checking is in places where it was useful for the Flask implementation at the time. But of course, that never really got fully adopted upstream, and we've been continuing to build on it since. So we've logically been putting in operations because the new way looks like the way the old code used to look like, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was a clever idea.
Yeah, so it's not 100%. So there are a couple of the sub-op checks that actually do check that you had a target set, and those typically were operations where they were wanting to make sure that it was a sub-op that you wanted to restrict down to emulation domains and things like the emulation device emulation domain and everything. So specifically for stub domains and things like that. So there are a couple of places where there was more than just hook, but a majority of the sub-op checks were actually done with hooks, or with XSM_hook, which translate to XSM role none for me.
Yeah, that's also a really weird thing. You look at XSM hook, and what it means is nothing.
Yes,
but it's not spelled that way. It looks like there's security where there really is none.
That's why I changed it to none, to be more explicit that there is no role check being done there.
I mean, it almost seems like if you drop that wherever you're putting in hook, there shouldn't be anything, right? Because you're not actually doing a security check. I guess.
Right, which is what it would do.
Change with Flask.
Correct.
I mean, another option might be to just go through and delete that.
Can I break in here and say we're technically out of time,